Juniper Station had been empty for 9 years. At least, that was what the deed said. But when Silas Mercer pried open the freight cellar door, he heard someone breathing beneath the floor. Then a woman stepped out of the darkness and pressed the broken tip of a cavalry saber against his throat. Behind her stood 2 more women. All 3 were Apache. All 3 looked hungry enough to fall, and none of them believed Silas when he said, "I'm not here to drive you out." The blade stayed at his neck. Silas kept both hands where she could see them. He was 30 years old, alone, and nearly broke. The station had cost him every dollar he had saved from 6 years of bridge work along the railroad. The roof sagged. The stable leaned east. Half the windows were gone. It was still the first place he had ever owned. Now he understood why the seller had accepted so little. The woman holding the saber was perhaps 33, lean from hunger but steady on her feet. Her black hair was braided close and tied behind her neck. A faded wool blanket covered one shoulder. Her eyes never left his. "You bought this place?" she asked. Her English was careful, not weak. "I did. Then you bought what was already taken." Silas glanced past her. The cellar held 3 bedrolls made from old feed sacks, a clay water jar, 2 rabbit skins, and a small pile of mesquite beans. The younger woman in the corner was shivering under a torn shawl. The third held a length of firewood like a club. They had not broken into a home. They had survived inside a ruin. Silas slowly lowered the pry bar he was carrying and set it on the floor. "My name is Silas." No one answered. "I have food in my wagon." The woman's eyes narrowed. "We do not need your mercy." A stomach growled in the dark. Not his. Silas looked toward the trapdoor, then back at the blade. "Good," he said, "because mercy is expensive. Supper is just supper." For the first time, the woman's expression changed. Not trust, confusion. Silas backed away 1 step at a time, climbed out of the cellar, and crossed the station yard beneath the orange light of sunset. His mule watched him from beside the wagon, ears turned forward as if it had heard the entire conversation. "What?" Silas muttered. "You would have handled it better." He brought back a sack of corn cakes, smoked venison, dried peaches, and a tin cup of water. He placed everything near the cellar opening, then sat against the opposite wall. The woman lowered the saber, but only an inch. The youngest moved first. She snatched 1 corn cake and retreated. The second woman took the peaches. The leader waited, studying Silas, then passed the water behind her before taking any for herself. They ate without speaking, not quickly, carefully, as if they had learned that every meal might be the last one for days. When they finished, Silas leaned his head against the wall. "I can sleep in the stable tonight." The woman looked almost offended. "This is your station, and that is your blade." A faint sound came from the youngest woman, a laugh she tried to hide. The leader finally lowered the weapon. "My name is Marra," she said. Then she pointed. "Tavi, Neli." Silas repeated each name once, making sure he had heard correctly. Marra watched him do it. "What happens in the morning?" she asked. Silas looked around at the cracked plaster, the collapsed shelving, the cold air sliding through the broken window. "In the morning, I start fixing this place." "And us?" "You are not something I know how to fix." Marra's jaw tightened. Silas raised 1 hand. "That came out wrong. What I mean is, you are people. You decide what happens to you." The saber dropped another inch. "You can stay until you decide where else to go," he said. "No payment. No bargain hidden underneath." Marra gave him a long, hard look. "Men always hide the bargain. Then you will have plenty of time to find mine." He stood, took his blanket, and walked toward the stable. At the doorway he stopped. "There is a bolt on the cellar door. Lock it from the inside." He heard the bolt slide into place before he reached the yard. Silas slept badly. The wind pushed through the stable slats. His mule shifted all night. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the cold edge of the broken saber at his throat. But what kept him awake was not fear. It was the look on Marra's face when he told her she could stay. She had looked at him as if kindness were another kind of trap. At dawn, Silas built a small fire in the yard and boiled coffee. The station door opened after the sun touched the ridge. Marra came out first. Tavi followed with the firewood still in her hand. Neli remained close to the wall, her shawl wrapped tightly around her. Silas poured coffee into 2 tin cups and 1 chipped clay mug. "I only own 3 cups," he said. "I will survive." Marra did not smile, but Tavi almost did. They sat far enough away that no one could mistake the distance for comfort. Silas warmed beans in a pan and tore the last of the corn cakes into 4 pieces. For a while, the only sound was the fire. Then Marra said, "Our camp was near the White Mountains." Silas waited. Fever came after the soldiers moved families through the valley. People were crowded, food was short. My mother died first, then Tavi's husband. Neli lost everyone. Neli stared into the flames. We left before the agency men returned, Tavi said. Her voice was low and rough. They called it running away. What did you call it? Silas asked. Living. The word landed harder than a shout. Marra told him they had walked south for weeks. At dry wells, the townspeople refused them food. A ranch hand followed them beyond the last house and fired a rifle into the dirt near Neli's feet, so they climbed into the hills. Juniper Station had no roof over half the stable, but it had a cellar, a spring and walls thick enough to stop the wind. They had been there for 7 weeks. Silas looked at the station as if seeing it for the first time. The cellar had called it worthless. To 3 women with nowhere else to go, it had been the difference between danger and death. You should know something, Silas said. Dry wells is where I have to buy lumber, nails, flour, lamp oil. If they learn you are here, they may make trouble. They will learn, Marra said. Yes, you can still tell us to leave. Silas shook his head. I spent half my life sleeping in bunkhouses where one man owned the roof and another man owned the work. Every time I began to feel settled, someone else decided I was temporary. He looked at the station. I am tired of temporary. Marra studied him across the fire. So are we, she said. That became the first agreement, not friendship, not trust. Just 4 tired people refusing to move again. The next 10 days changed the station faster than Silas could have managed alone. Tavi understood wood better than he expected. She could look at a warped board, turn it twice in her hands, and find the one way it could still carry weight. Together, she and Silas rebuilt the west window frame and braced the stable wall. Neli cleared stones behind the kitchen and dug narrow planting beds where the winter sun stayed longest. She saved every bean and squash seed from their meals. She also wove willow strips into baskets so tight they could hold flour. Marra mapped the land. She found a second spring hidden behind red rock, a patch of edible cactus fruit, and a stand of juniper where the ground remained dry after rain. She knew which trails belonged to deer, which belonged to coyotes, and which had been made by men. She spoke little while she worked, but every evening she sat closer to the fire. On the 12th day, Silas's mule came in limping. The left foreleg was swollen above the hoof. A sharp piece of stone had cut deep and left dirt inside the wound. Silas crouched beside the animal, angry at himself. I should have seen it. Marra knelt on the other side. Anger will not clean the cut. She washed the leg with boiled water, drew out the grit with a narrow bone tool, and packed the wound with a bitter-smelling paste of crushed leaves and resin. The mule trembled. Marra placed one hand against its cheek and spoke quietly in Apache. The animal settled. Silas watched her work. You learned this from your mother? Marra nodded. She healed people and animals. She said pain changes its voice, but not its meaning. What does that mean? It means you listen before you decide what hurts. Silas looked at her. The words were meant for the mule. They did not feel that way. 3 days later, the swelling was gone. By then, Silas had begun riding the mule into dry wells twice a week for supplies. He bought more than usual because 4 people were eating, but he split his purchases between stores and kept his answers short. That worked until a boy from town followed his tracks into the hills. The boy did not come close. He did not need to. He saw Neli hanging rabbit skins near the station wall. By noon the next day, everyone in Dry Wells knew. Silas entered Harlan Pike's store with a list in his pocket. Pike was broad through the shoulders, with a beard cut square and clean. He stood behind the counter while 6 men watched from beside the flour barrels. Morning, Silas said. No one answered. He placed his list down. Pike did not touch it. They say you have Apache women living at Juniper Station. They have names. That was not my question. Silas looked around the room. The men were not curious. They had already chosen what they wanted to hear. They are under my roof, Silas said. One of the ranchers spat into a brass cup. Your roof sits 3 miles above our water road. My deed includes the station, the yard, and the spring, not people we drove out. Silas felt something cold move through him. You fired at a girl and call that driving someone out? The rancher's face reddened. Pike pushed the list back across the counter. No flour, no nails, no lamp oil, not from me. You are refusing money. I am refusing trouble. Silas glanced at the shelves. Trouble seems well stocked. No one laughed. Pike leaned forward. Send the women away. Come back alone. Then we do business. Silas folded the list and put it in his pocket. No. The word was quiet. That made it heavier. He left with nothing. At the blacksmith shop, the doors were closed, though smoke rose from the chimney. At the feed shed, the owner turned his sign around while Silas watched. By afternoon, the boycott was complete. Dry wells had decided hunger could do what rifle fire had failed to do. Silas rode home with an empty wagon. Marra saw it before he spoke. "They know," she said. "They know, and they refused you." "Yes," Tavi cursed under her breath. Neli looked toward the road. "We should go before they come." Silas climbed down from the wagon. "No," Marra's eyes hardened. "You do not know what they will do. I know what they want me to do. That is not the same thing." "No," Silas said, "it is not." He walked to the spring and splashed water on his face. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from rage. Marra followed. "You could lose the station. I could. You could be hurt. So could you. We are used to it." Silas turned so fast she stepped back. "That does not make it acceptable." The anger in his voice surprised both of them. Marra stared at him. Silas forced himself to breathe. "I am sorry." "No," she said, "do not be sorry for that." That night they counted everything they had. Enough flour for 6 days, beans for 12, salt for 3 weeks, dried meat for perhaps 4. Tavi had 6 rabbit snares. Neli's garden had not yet taken root. The second spring was clean, but winter would come early in the hills. Silas spread the deed across the table. A thin blue line marked the old wagon road from Dry Wells to a mining camp north of the ridge. "Copper Bell buys baskets, leather repairs, salves, anything useful," he said. "It is a longer ride, but they do not answer to Pike." Tavi touched the map. "The pass is steep, so we travel light." Marra looked at the empty pantry. "You still have a choice." Silas folded the deed. "I made it when I did not unlock the cellar. The boycott did not starve them. It changed them." Tavi repaired harness and saddle leather for teamsters moving through the northern pass. Neli sold 6 willow baskets at Copper Bell, then returned with orders for 12 more. Marra made pine resin salve for cracked hands and sore joints. Silas rebuilt the station's front room into a trading post for travelers who had no reason to enter Dry Wells. They stopped waiting for the town to let them live. That was when the town became dangerous. One cold evening, Silas found a red notice nailed to the station door. Water claim disputed, hearing in 10 days. Harlan Pike claimed the upper spring belonged to Dry Wells by customary use. If he won, Juniper Station would lose the only water source that stayed reliable through winter. Silas read the notice twice. Tavi tore it down. "They cannot take what is on your deed. They can try." Marra looked toward the ridge. "This is not about water." "No," Silas said. "It is about making us leave without saying why." For the next week, Silas prepared for the hearing. He rode to the county office and paid for a copy of the original survey. The clerk warned him that Pike had friends on the local board. When Silas returned, Marra showed him something she had found near the spring. Boot prints. 6 men, one carried a keg. The prints stopped above the water channel. Silas ran uphill. A sharp chemical smell met him before he saw the stain. Someone had poured lamp oil into the shallow run that fed the station trough. Neli stood behind him, horrified. "Our water? The main spring is protected," Marra said. "This branch only feeds the trough." Silas clenched his fists. They did not know that. That night no one slept. They took turns watching the road. At midnight, hoofbeats climbed the hill. Lanterns appeared between the junipers. 12 men rode into the yard. Harlan Pike sat in front. "This is your last warning," he called. "Send them away before the hearing and the water claim disappears." Silas stepped onto the porch with a shotgun held low. "I have the survey." Pike smiled. "Paper burns." Behind him, a man lifted a bottle plugged with cloth. Marra came through the doorway carrying the broken cavalry saber. Tavi stood at one window with a hunting bow. Neli held a bucket beside the rain barrel. Pike looked at them and laughed. "This is what you choose, Mercer? 3 runaways and a ruin?" Silas felt the old loneliness rise inside him. Years of bunkhouses, years of leaving before anyone could leave him, years of pretending he needed nothing because needing something gave the world a place to cut. He stepped down from the porch. "I choose the people standing with me." Pike's smile vanished. The bottle flew. Flames spread across the dry straw beside the stable. Neli threw the first bucket. Tavi ran for the mule. Silas fired once into the air. The yard exploded into motion. Some riders pulled back, others shouted. One man rushed the porch with a club. Marra struck his wrist with the flat of the saber. Silas tackled another man near the fire. A boot hit his ribs. He rolled, came up, and saw Pike reaching for Neli. Silas crossed the space between them and drove Pike into the trough. Pike's men dragged him free. Then a woman's voice cut through the noise. "Enough." Ada Voss stood in the road holding a lantern high. She was the town midwife, a widow, and the closest thing Dry Wells had to a doctor. 2 teamsters from Copperbell stood behind her with rifles. Ada looked at the burning straw, the oil bottle, the armed men. Then she looked at Pike. If this stable catches the Junipers, the fire runs downhill into your own town. Pike wiped water from his face. This is not your affair. You made it mine when you brought fire into dry country. She turned to the men. Ride home now. Or I testify at the county hearing that Harlan Pike tried to burn a lawful property while its occupants were inside. The word lawful worked where compassion had not. One rider turned, then another. Pike stayed a moment longer, hatred bright in his eyes. This is not finished. Ada lifted the lantern. No, it is documented. He rode away. The others followed. Silas watched the lights disappear down the road. Then the pain in his side arrived all at once. He took one step and collapsed. When he opened his eyes, he was inside the station. Marra sat beside him. His shirt was open. A dark bruise spread across his ribs, and a cut above his temple had been stitched with black thread. Broken, he whispered. 2 ribs, perhaps. Ada agrees. Where is she? Sleeping in the front room. Tavi and Neli are watching the yard. Silas tried to sit up. Marra pushed him down. Do that again and I will break the other ribs myself. He almost laughed. It hurt too much. Marra's hands were steady, but her face was not. There were tears she refused to let fall. Silas reached for her wrist. You are safe. Her expression sharpened. You were on the ground. Pike had a knife, I thought. She stopped. Silas waited. I thought the station would become empty again, she said. The words were barely audible. Silas's hand moved from her wrist to her fingers. It will not. You cannot promise that. No. He looked at their joined hands. But I can promise I am done leaving before I have something to lose. Marra lowered her eyes. You have something to lose? Silas looked toward the wall separating them from Tavi and Neli. He heard the mule shifting in the stable, the soft crackle of the stove. Ada's cough from the front room, then he looked back at Marra. Yes. Her fingers tightened around his. For a long time neither of them spoke. The station had nearly burned. The town still wanted them gone. The water hearing was 6 days away. And yet in that dim room Silas felt less alone than he had at any time in his life. At the hearing, Ada Voss testified first, then the 2 Copperbell teamsters. Then Silas placed the original survey on the table and showed that the upper spring had been recorded as part of Juniper Station 23 years earlier. Pike's claim failed. The county board also warned him that another act of violence would bring federal charges. Dry Wells did not apologize, but it stopped coming up the road. Winter settled over the hills. Snow covered the North Pass. The trading post closed for weeks at a time. Inside the station, the 4 of them learned the shape of ordinary life. Tavi rebuilt an old loom from freightwood. Neli coaxed onions and winter greens from the sunniest wall. Marra kept jars of dried leaves, resin, salt, and clean cloth above the stove. Silas repaired everything that could be repaired and invented uses for everything that could not. At night they ate at one table. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they did not need to. Silas and Marra never named what had begun between them. It lived in smaller things. The way she left coffee near his tools before dawn, the way he warmed her gloves beside the stove, the way their shoulders touched at the table and neither moved away. Then, after the first hard thaw, Ada Voss rode up the hill alone. Her horse was white with foam. She nearly fell when she dismounted. Silas caught her. What happened? Dry Wells is sick. Ada's face was gray with exhaustion. 23 people in 3 days. Children first, then older folks. Fever, vomiting, stomach pain. 2 ranch families are down. Horses are refusing water. Cattle are weak. Marra stepped from the doorway. Same water? Ada looked at her. The town well and the lower creek. When did the snow melt? 4 days ago. Marra's eyes moved toward the eastern ridge. The old freight cut, she said. Silas understood the direction, not the meaning. What about it? Marra grabbed her blanket. The creek changes after the first thaw. Water moves under the rock before it reaches town. Ada took one step toward her. Can you help? Silence filled the yard. This was the same town that had denied them food. The same town that had fired near Neli's feet. The same town that had tried to burn their home. Ada did not hide from that truth. I have no right to ask, she said, but children are getting weaker by the hour. Marra looked at Tavi, then Neli. The 3 women spoke quietly in Apache. Silas could not follow the words. He did not try. Finally, Marra turned to Ada. We will look at the water first. No one asked whether Dry Wells deserved help. That was not the question. The question was whether they would allow innocent people to die because guilty people lived beside them. Marra had already answered. They followed the lower creek upstream. The snowmelt had cut a new path through the abandoned freight road. At the base of the ridge, the water disappeared beneath broken stone, then surfaced half a mile below. Marra knelt beside the first pool. She did not drink. She touched the surface, smelled her fingers, then examined a brown stain on the snow. Animals crossed here. Tavi found hoof marks near the old cut. Neli found black feathers trapped between rocks. They climbed higher. Behind a collapsed retaining wall, they discovered a dead mule wedged in a narrow runoff channel. The thawing water passed beneath the carcass, through stagnant mud, and down toward the town well. Ada covered her mouth. Dear God, Marra looked at the channel. Boiling will help, but the lower well must be closed now. No one drinks from it, no animals. Silas and Tavi pulled the carcass free with rope and mule power. Neli marked the contaminated run with strips of red cloth. Ada rode back to town with instructions. Fresh water had to come from the upper ridge spring. Every bucket had to be boiled. The sick needed small, frequent sips with salt and molasses, not full cups that would come back up. Bedding had to be washed. Waste had to be buried far from the creek. No one argued. Fear had made the town teachable. For 2 days, Juniper Station became the center of the valley. Silas hauled water down the ridge. Tavi organized ranch hands into teams and forced them to keep clean buckets separate from dirty ones. Neli cared for children whose mothers were too weak to stand. She sang softly while spooning boiled broth between cracked lips. Marra worked beside Ada from bed to bed. She cooled fevers, cleaned soiled blankets, watched for people who could no longer swallow, and sent the worst cases to the station, where the upper spring remained clean. She did not perform miracles. She noticed details. A child whose hands had gone cold. An old man whose breathing changed. A woman too weak to ask for water. Each time she acted before panic took over. On the second night, Harlan Pike's youngest son stopped responding. Pike stood beside the bed, broken in a way Silas had never imagined possible. Marra pressed her fingers to the boy's throat, then looked at Ada. Warm stones, not hot. Under his arms and beside his legs, slow sips when he wakes. Pike stared at her. Will he live? I do not know. It was the only honest answer. Pike lowered his head. Marra stayed beside the boy until dawn. Just after sunrise, he opened his eyes and asked for his mother. Pike walked outside and wept behind the water barrels. By the 4th day, no new families had fallen sick. By the 6th, the fevers were breaking. By the 9th, the cattle were drinking clean water from temporary troughs. Children stood in doorways wrapped in blankets. The lower well remained sealed while men dug a new channel away from the freight cut. Dry wells had survived. Not because the town had been strong, because the people it tried to cast out had understood the land better than the people who claimed to own it. A week later, the town gathered in front of Pike's store. No one carried stones, no one carried fire. The county board chairman held a folded paper. Ada stood beside him. Harlan Pike stood in front with his hat in both hands. Silas arrived with Marra, Tavi, and Neli. The crowd parted. Pike looked at Marra first. His voice failed once before he found it. You saved my boy. Marra said nothing. You saved all of us. Still, she said nothing. Pike looked down at his hands. I called you a danger because it was easier than admitting I knew nothing about you. I tried to take your water. I brought fire to your home. The square was silent. I cannot undo that, he said, but I can name it. I was wrong. Then he turned to Tavi and Neli. I was wrong to you, too. The board chairman opened the folded paper. It confirmed Juniper Station's spring rights permanently and recognized the trading post road as public access. The town merchants also agreed to sell goods without restriction. Silas listened. Then he looked at Marra. She was not smiling. An apology could not return the dead. A paper could not erase the shot fired near Neli's feet. Acceptance offered only after rescue was not the same as justice, but it was a beginning. Marra stepped forward. We do not need permission to live at Juniper Station, she said. The chairman lowered the paper. Marra continued. We needed you to stop trying to make us disappear. No one moved. Then Ada Voss nodded. One by one, others did the same. Not everyone, but enough to change what came next. Spring reached the hills slowly. The North Pass opened. Teamsters returned. Travelers stopped at Juniper Station for water, repairs, baskets, salves, and news of the road ahead. Tavi's leatherwork became known as far as Copperbell. Neli planted a garden twice the size of the first. Ada visited every Sunday, sometimes for medicine, sometimes for coffee, sometimes because friendship no longer required an emergency. Harlan Pike sent lumber to replace the stable wall his men had burned. Silas almost refused it. Marra told him refusing useful wood would not improve the world, so he accepted the lumber and made Pike unload it himself. That helped. One evening Silas found Marra on the ridge above the station. Below them lamplight filled every repaired window. Tavi was laughing at something Ada had said. Neli stood in the yard shaking dust from a blanket. The mule waited beside a new trough fed by clean water. Silas sat beside Marra. When I bought this place, the seller said no one had been foolish enough to want it. Marra looked down at the station. He was wrong. About which part? The place was wanted. Silas smiled. After a moment he reached for her hand. She let him take it. I used to think a home was a roof no one could take from you, he said. And now? Now I think it is the people who stay when taking the roof would be easier. Marra leaned her head against his shoulder. Below them the station door opened and warm light spilled across the yard. The deed had described Juniper Station as abandoned. It never was. It had been waiting for 4 people the world had tried to leave behind.